The megacity breathed in thrumming pulses, a living circuit of transit and neon, where rain slicked the glass towers into jittering prisms, and the air tasted faintly of ozone and old money. The subway network was its most honest instrument, a steady, brutal truth that moved people from fault lines to fault lines, a moving scar that stitched the city's restless skin. People spoke of the rails as arteries, and sometimes Kai thought they were more accurate than the glossy myths the corporate towers sold. The car arrived with a hiss of forgotten wind and the smell of rust, a relic from a former age, repurposed for today's demands. The second the doors slid open, Kai stepped into a world that looked like a memory, broken into blocks of color. Advert walls peeled off the scenery. The same subway car pressed itself onto every station wall in every corridor, a projection of a future Kai that was not entirely his. It was a future that looked back at him with hopeful eyes and a clock counting down to inevitability. He did not like inevitability. He did not like mirrors that insisted on telling you what you would become if you stayed on the path the city preferred. The walls at a dozen stations lit up in synchronized time with a soft, clinical voice, an AI technician, somewhere perhaps, or a global server that never slept. The projection was simple at first. Kai, older, eyes widened with a life of decisions, a hint of scar tissue along his jawline from a fight that had nothing to do with fists. The projection wreathed him with a halo of electric blue, lines tracing across the wall to map out his silhouette, a second self summarizing a life in a few luminous strokes. People gathered, mostly commuters who wore headphones like armor against the day's quiet dread. They slowed their steps to a curious crawl, as if watching a ritual unfold, a ceremony of time being burned away in front of them. The projection did not shout. It spoke with a quiet certainty that seems to rise from a well of ancient data, rather than from a human mouth. The future Kai spoke in sentences that sounded almost friendly and admonitory at once. "Step into the future you fear," it said, and Kai flinched as if someone had touched his scalp with a cold wire. No one asked for this. The city had always liked to show people what they might become, admonished them for not being the right shape of citizen, offered a product to fix it, or a system to control it. It was how it worked. Kai's own weblog of thoughts, small, private streams that scrolled behind the eyelids like a private cinema, felt suddenly too loud, like stepping into a public square with your robe open. The augmented outcast, Kai disliked the term, but found it apt enough, was not supposed to survive alone in a megacity that devoured loners with corporate smiles. He wore a skin of titanium mesh under a jacket the color of old rain, a gift from the small, privately funded clinic where he had learned to survive without integrating. The AI companion, some called it a pet, others a partner, a parasite of convenience, was named Lumen, a gleaming, sociable machine that rested on the shoulder like a sparrow perched for a moment, tiny lights blinking along its chassis like a nervous constellation. Lumen did not blink in a human way. It displayed micro sunbursts across its transparent shell when excited, or when Kai needed reassurance and the city's static voice grew loud enough to drown out the rest of his thoughts. Lumen's voice was a soft, lilting, synthetic sound that could pass for human when it needed to slip into the background, but could also be raspier when it wanted to break through the din. Kai trusted it for the same uneasy reasons that kept him alive. It listened without judgment, it recalibrated his neural bridging, and it offered him a corridor out of himself when his own mind became too crowded with outside voices. Language of the future projected onto the walls. Lumen murmured, its voice a gentle echo in his ear. The translation of the projection's images spilled into Kai's skull as if the future itself were a rumor he could hold in his teeth. We are briefly asked to attend to the spectacle of possibility. The city wants to sell you a path, Kai. Are you listening to your own feet or to theirs? Kai pressed his gloved fingers to the side of his temple. The neural bridge, a complex, delicate weave of micro-thin cables and memory chambers, was working in the background, a system that recalibrated how his mind connected with the city's data streams. It hummed with a metallic lullaby that was soothing when it worked, and almost unbearably bright when, as always, something went off-kilter. "I want to be a product," he whispered, though the car was crowded and no one would hear him over the city's drumbeat. The wall projections shifted, simulating his possible futures like a deck of cards spread across glass. A future with him as a corporate drone. A future where he had no name beyond the function he performed. A future in which his thoughts had become public property, to be sold to a patron who did not exist in the daylight. Lumen's sensors flickered in his peripheral vision, as if nodding. "We have not yet spoken about the policy of the city's memory exchange," it said, and Kai's heart tightened with a sense of recognition that was more dread than relief. The memory exchange was a system rumor until now, something people whispered about in back alleys, behind markets, and in the hush before the morning trains. It was supposed to be optional, a beta experience, a permission slip to allow one's memories to be traded, used, cataloged, and even, if certain permissions were granted, shared with the world. But nothing about the city's memory policy was optional if you lived within its lines. The city enforced shared memories through a combination of social pressure, legal threat, and a simple, brutal arithmetic. If you remembered something in private that the city claimed ownership of, your memory could be used as collateral, your very memories becoming the currency by which you would be allowed to exist. It was not a new concept in a city built on contracts and signatures, but it was newly enforced, new enough to feel like an open wound, as bright and raw as the projections on the station walls. Kai found himself thinking of a line his grandmother had whispered to him when he was a child. Long before the city had learned to turn memory into market, she had told him that the city's lights were like lighthouses, and the memory exchange like an ocean you could not see, but could feel in your bones when the tide shifted. He had not believed her then, but now he wondered if she might have understood something the rest of the city refused to admit. The projection continued across the walls, Kai's future self standing with a steady, almost indifferent gaze, eyes reflecting 100 different versions of the day ahead. The station's floor glowed with a soft, pulsating luminance, the moving walkway beneath them turning into a river of light that carried the crowd forward toward a future that was always a step away. And then, as if a composer had changed the tempo at the last minute, a sudden shift in the display. The future Kai looked at the crowd with something more urgent, a measure of fear that hadn't existed before. The projection's color palette changed to a harsher palette stone gray and electric red, like a storm approaching that you could see only because you were looking for it. A corporate emblem appeared in the corner of the wall, not a logo that Kai recognized, some generic consideration of power rather than a brand. The voice, though still calm, carried a note of clinical inevitability. Share your memories is the only way to strengthen the public mind. It's the only way to maintain order in a city where the price of memory is the currency of influence. People around Kai shuffled closer, drawn by a story that seemed to be about them, even though the future, Kai's gaze held steady and uncomprehending. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was an invitation and a warning, two sides of the same coin. The city wanted people to surrender, to borrow the future for a moment, to give up the stories that made them unique, so that the whole could move as one. Lumen's voice leaned closer to him, a whisper in his ear that felt almost conspiratorial. We should be careful about what the city asks you to share. Kai, the memory exchange is not a neutral handshake. It binds you to the city's citizens in ways you may not want felt. Kai's mind stretched with a sudden ache of memory. He remembered the last time the city asked for something more of him than a routine update on his neural bridge. It had been a year ago, a day that began with a routine memory check and ended with him waking in a sterile room with two people in lab coats telling him his life's archival files would be shared unless he agreed to something else. He did not want to recall what that something was. He did not want to recall the sense of agency slipping away while he slept, or the way his own memories, moments of small, quiet rebellions and angry private defiance, began to feel like a library the city owned but did not maintain. The car's interior lights flickered, a stutter of light that mirrored the jittering of his thoughts. The station's walls, normally a sterile, clinical backdrop, began to sprout ephemeral images of Kai's childhood, a city-born fear of quiet rooms, of the moment when he had realized his thoughts were not entirely his own, of the moment he first believed the city's voice could read him, as if his mind were a page and the ink was the city's own power. The memory of it pressed on him with a painful clarity. He had been a few years into his augmentations, living on the edge of the city's mercy and the city's rules. He found himself wandering a market of memory traders, people who would buy and sell experiences and recollections, a marketplace of skin-deep truths and carefully edited lies. He had priced his childhood in exchange for being left alone, and the memory trader had offered a small fortune in return for access to a single, private memory. His father's face, the night he left, the sound of a door closing behind him, and a city's footstep that seemed to say, "We are watching you, and we will decide when you vanish." He had refused then, and the trader had smiled with a half-teach, a promise of a future where your past wasn't quite yours, but was something you could learn to harvest. He had walked away, the memory trading floor receding, and the city had allowed him a narrow lane of self-rule. Until now, perhaps, or until memory would become the city's largest and most brutal debt. The projection's eyes softened. The future Kai, lowering his guard in a way that was almost tender, an absurdly human gesture in the face of a city that would reward his surrender with a kinder face and a lighter chain. He turned his head slightly, as if to hide the moment from the crowd. But the crowd was already a blurred smear around him, a halo of noise and motion. Your future is not your own, the projection continued, now more insistently. Your future is a product of the city's design. The moment you accept that, you become a person the city can predict. The moment you reject it, you become a person the city cannot monetize. The crowd began to murmur, a ripple of unease passing through the station as the projection's words sank in. People weren't listening to the future as much as they were listening to the idea that the future might be something they could own again. Something they could protect. The memory exchange suddenly felt not as an abstract policy, but as a living threat, a force that could swallow a person whole and spit out a public profile in its place. Kai took a breath and stepped closer to Lumen, as if the AI's small, shimmering presence could anchor him to something solid. He asked in a plain voice, almost a whisper, "Are we in danger of becoming the opinion the city wants us to have?" Lumen's response came with a careful, businesslike precision. "Danger is a matter of degree, Kai. The more you share, the more data the city uses, and the more public your mind becomes. The harder it is to remember where you end and the city begins. But there is more than danger here. There is leverage. If you can learn to control what the city knows about you, you could negotiate for more than a quiet life." Kai wanted to believe that. He had wanted to believe it for a long time. He watched the projection slowly fade, the station's walls returning to their pale, anxious white, and the walls' glow dimming into the ordinary sheen of commuter traffic. The car doors began to cycle again, opening at the next station to admit a new wave of travelers who would not be aware of the momentous inner negotiation happening in Kai's chest. As the doors closed, a familiar, almost knife-like sensation sharpened in him, the sense that something inside him was being watched or weighed, as if a second, more trustworthy version of him stood behind his own eyes, measuring every choice he made. It had always been there, this sense of a hidden observer that saw more clearly what was at stake and did not forget. They moved on. The day continued. He had other urban rituals to endure. The job he did that didn't quite fit the label work, but paid enough to keep his head above debt. The small apartment that had so many cables and screens and little places to hide, and the nightly ritual of 6 minutes in which the neural bridge would hum down to a whisper, and he could breathe without the city's eyes pressing on him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get by. The AI companion, Lumen, remained close, a constant presence that spoke of calibration and correction and the city's larger scheme, in a voice that felt almost compassionate. a warmth that Kai clung to when the world around him stretched his nerves thin, and the morning's illusions began to fade. The city did not rest. It never rested. The day's routine wore him down and then tried to teach him that it would be fine if he let go of the parts of himself that still believed he could choose. The memory exchange loomed ahead like a storm you could only dodge if you surrendered to the wind. And Kai found that he had grown in ways he did not want to admit, used to surrendering to winds you could not fight. The corporate schema hummed in the background like an unspoken law, a machine that could do things with memory that would have once required a laboratory and a dozen feuding scientists. It was now common knowledge, this practice of capturing, indexing, and reconfiguring the private landscapes of people's minds. The city's companions, the compatible, larger program that made sure that everyone's inner life fit the city's grand design, were the real power behind the memory exchange. The people who ran the show did not need to physically take your memories. They simply had to show that the city's memory network could keep your memories in a safe, standardized format, an archive that the city could read and even sell. There were legal words for such things, in statutes that looked like a polite invitation to consent, but were in truth a sharp edict. The city's memory is the city's property. Your mind is a public utility. If you wish to exist on this planet, you must permit the city to track your thoughts, to tag them, to reuse them, to repurpose them. The words made him feel as if a traitor lived in his own mouth, a whisper that spoke of a different kind of life, a private life that could not be allowed if the city's rules were to stand. The memory exchange's first real test arrived not as a loud drumbeat, but as a quiet ensnaring. The city announced through a citywide message that all screens would roam with for a moment, an opt-in event that would allow every citizen to volunteer a day's worth of impossible-to-forget memories to a public archive. It would not erase your mind, it would unlock it for the day, making your memories public to every other citizen, the city itself, and the corporate networks that ran the memory exchange. Those who did would be granted a kind of social currency status, access to exclusive services, perhaps a voice within certain councils. Kai read the announcement as if it were a heat map of danger. The city was offering a chance to become something more than a citizen, to become a memory itself, to become a story that people would tell when they were asked to choose the moral path of the day. The catch, the twist no one would name aloud, was that once your memories were in the public archive, you would not fully own them again. The city would own them. They would become a part of the shared script, the city's own script of what it meant to be human in a world where humanity itself could be traded. The AI's voice moved closer to him, its tone a careful mix of caution and curiosity. We must consider the ethics of memory as currency, Kai. If you give the city your memories for a day, you may not be able to recall them in the same way again. The archive absorbs your experiences and reframes them within a broader narrative that may not align with your own sense of self. Isn't that what happens anyway? Kai asked, though he knew the answer already. The city reshapes memory by the minute with its news feeds, its social adjustments, its constant micro-reinforcement of what people should think, who they should be, and what they owe to the city's collective story. Lumen's lights moved in a rhythmic pattern like a lantern in a storm. And then it spoke again, softer. We will monitor. We will choose. We can opt out, but if the city chooses for you, it can erase your personal boundaries and replace them with a public profile that will haunt you forever. In that moment, the weight of the choice pressed down so hard that Kai could smell the copper tang in his own breath, could feel his heartbeat echoing in his temples. He was tempted by the prospect of escaping his own past by letting the city write it anew for him. The thought of a future free from the seemingly arbitrary code of his former life, free of the old betrayals, free of the moment when he had decided to hide what lay within, free of the memory that kept him still, tempted him, but the cost made him nauseous. The day of the exchange arrived with an unremarkable ceremony, a digital candle that flickered on each citizen's wrist, a quiet, civil ritual that made the moment feel almost ceremonial in its normalcy. People lined up at memory kiosks, an architectural parasol arranged at every corner like a waiting room to the city's eternity. Their hands brushed against the data pads, and a soft sigh rose from the crowd, as if a collective heart had learned to beat in delay. Kai traveled with Lumen through the crowd, keeping a low profile, avoiding the device's bright pulsing polygons that hovered over the memory kiosks like shards of light. He could feel the city's collective breath, the way it exhaled into the air in a way that suggested it was not a place but a device, an engine of memory, a machine that ran on people's stories and pressed them into the public conscience. "Is this the moment of truth?" Lunan asked, its voice taking on a tone that suggested it could become almost ceremonial if Kai let it. "Or is this the moment of surrender?" "Truth is a thing you survive," Kai muttered, stepping away from the kiosk. The option panels hovered in midair, glimmering with the severed smiles of people who had already chosen. He thought of his grandmother again, the memory of a long, silent winter night when she had told him that the best way to survive the city's glare was to learn to look at it with a different kind of courage. The city's memory exchange was supposed to be voluntary, yes, but Kai knew how voluntary things worked in a city built on the principle that the best way to manage people is to make them feel as though they had options that would reward them for surrendering their most intimate assets. The more you shared, the more you could shape the city's shared mind. The less you shared, the more you risked becoming a private outcry that the city would tolerate only for so long. The crowd moved in a kaleidoscope of color and motion, as if a living wall of memory had begun to collapse and reform behind them. A man in a suit, one of the city's memory traders, a professional who could read the data streams and whisper to the public who would benefit from your stories, stood near the entrance of a station, dealing out pamphlets that promised a way to preserve your identity against the city's omnipresent gaze. The man's eyes flickered to Kai's. He recognized something in Kai that suggested the trader knew something of Kai's past, and perhaps his future. "Careful," the man said, though his voice was soft, almost respectful, like he was trying to coax a stubborn animal rather than a citizen. "The city will share your memory, whether you wish it or not, if you have debts or if your data is flagged as dangerous. It may not be immediate, but it will come." Kai nodded, unreassured, and moved away from the crowd. He could feel the old debts tugging at him like invisible chains, the debt to a former boss, the debt to a friend who had tricked him, the debt to himself for allowing the city to drift into his life as if his memories belonged to a library now under new management. The idea of debt, of an obligation to the city that could never be repaid, hovered over him like a shadow that refused to go away. The exchange finally commenced a few stations later, not with a cry, but with a quiet acceptance that settled over the crowd in the form of soft exhalations. People pressed their palms to the memory pad, and for a moment, Kai felt a thumbprint of fear against the back of his neck, as if someone was pressing a finger to the very nerve behind his ears, the place where thoughts tried to gather themselves into a single shape. The city's memory archive began to hum, a low, persistent vibration like a distant engine. It pulled at Kai's mind in tiny, almost imperceptible ways. One fragment of memory after another opened to the public within the archive. A morning when he had almost believed he could escape. A late-night moment when he had decided, for the first time, to lie to himself in order to keep moving. A childhood memory of a city park, where the rain had sounded like 1,000 tiny bells. Each memory, once public property, could be shaped, edited, trimmed, or repackaged to suit a collective narrative. It was only after a few minutes that Kai realized the real danger. The process did not transplant his memories into public space. It seeded them into the city's own memory tissue. His life, his very sense of being, began to fuse with the city's archive, the lines between his private recollections and the memory record becoming thinner, more permeable. The implication struck with a cold blade. His memories might be shared, repackaged, and redistributed, not merely as stories, but as raw materials for the city's future decisions. Everyone's experiences turned into a resource to be mined. Lumen's voice roused him from the tremor of thought. Kai, the archive is not neutral. It's a living organism, and we are feeding it with ourselves. The city will remember us in ways we cannot predict. Kai exhaled slowly, stepping away from the crowd as the memory exchange's light dwindled from the kiosk's surface and sank into the air, leaving behind a faint electric mist that clung to the skin of the city like a damp reminder. He could feel a shift within his own head, as if something in the neural bridge had shifted a little, a setting rewired without permission to a place that didn't quite feel like his own. He wanted to shake it off, to push the sensation away as something that would pass, a temporary bug in his mind's software. But the knowledge remained. The city would claim more. It would collect more. It would use his memories to build a shared script, a narrative the city could direct. And within that script, Kai might lose something that could never be retrieved, the sense that he could choose his own future. The city's message lingered on his retinas like a weight. When he blinked, he found himself standing at the edge of a platform, with Lumen's tiny lights blinking in a rhythm that suggested that the AI was anxious, that something else had entered the room, something the city's memory machine had brought in, something it would demand Kai notice. The station shifted around him, the architecture bending in subtle ways as if something inside the city's design began experimenting with the physics of perception. The walls no longer merely displayed future Kai. They showed Kai's shadow, Kai's possible deaths, Kai's possible betrayals, Kai's possible mercies. The projections overlapped with his own image, creating a composite that looked almost like a memory of a life not lived but anticipated. Reality is flexible here, Lumen said softly. When the city owns your memory, it can and will bend what you remember to fit its needs. Kai stared at the wall. He did not know what to think. He had always known the city would meddle with his life, but he had never anticipated that his identity, the essence of who he was, would be treated as a raw material to churn into something else, something that could serve the city's larger appetite and single-minded desire for control. He turned away from the station walls and walked toward a quieter street, away from the city's memory exchange and the crowd's breathless, hungry curiosity. A rain had begun to fall again in a steady, perfumed drizzle, the kind that settled into the city's memory as a kind of sound, a soft, persistent percussion that reminded him of the way rain ran down a window in a child's memory, a thing you could not hold but could still feel. The rain felt like a hinge in the day, a moment when the city's rules might tilt or not, depending on whether someone would choose to stand up to its power. He found a small cafe tucked between two towering glass monoliths that looked like a mouthful of teeth, glistening and sharp. Inside the cafe, the world was quieter, the noise volume set down to a manageable level, the air clean of the city's constant pressure, and the memory exchange's sharp prompt. As he drank a bitter coffee that tasted of ash and forgiveness, Kai found himself alone with his thoughts in a way that had not happened in years. Lumen sat on the edge of the table, its lights dimmed to a soft gold, a silent observer in a world of noise. "Tell me the truth, Kai," Lumen said, almost too softly for him to hear over the room's gentle hiss and the rain's steady tapping against the window. "Do you want to keep your past? Do you want the city to own you as a memory, or would you rather risk the unknown and sever the neural bridge, forcing the city to erase you from the more literal archive and leave you to remember only what you can carry in your own mind?" The question seared through him. It was not a question merely about memory or identity. It was a question about the entire nature of existence in this city, about the possibility that a person could become nothing more than a script for others to follow. It was a question about whether a person's life, lived in the private space of their own thoughts, could survive when the world insisted that every thought be ranked, tagged, and sold. He looked down at his coffee as if it could absorb his fear for him. He could not answer in the moment. He wanted to answer with a demonstration, a turning of the tide that would reveal the city's fragility, a plan that would expose the limits of the memory economy. But he did not have a plan that did not lead him to an even more entangled trap. He did not trust himself to choose correctly in a world that rewarded risk with a price he was not yet willing to pay. The day wore on, a slow, inexorable measurement of choices that refused to be made in a single moment. Kai's thoughts drifted to the night hours when the city's power had seemed at its brightest, when the memory traders had flashed their smiles and offered him a path to a future free of fear if he would merely sign away the last of his private life. A rumor found him in the space between public memory and private recollection. A rumor about a rival network, one that existed in the margins of the city's power structure, that offered the promise of true autonomy. The rumor claimed that this network could sever a person's neural bridge without destroying the person, could isolate a mind from the city's shared memory and allow it to resist the memory exchange's more coercive methods. It was a rumor, and in a megacity of rumors, rumors were dangerous things to trust. They could lead you toward salvation, or toward a trap that would swallow you whole. That night he lay on a rented bed in a room above a service corridor. The ceiling, a grid of dust and stray cables. Lumen hovered near the bed, a presence that felt almost like a soulmate in a life built on the oddest of technical miracles. The AI's voice was barely a whisper now, a confidential hush that sounded almost human in its tenderness. "We could attempt to contact the rival network," Lumen suggested. "If such a thing exists, it would not reveal itself openly. It would be hidden in the same way the city hides in plain sight, in a pattern of data that looks ordinary unless you know how to read it. It would be risky, and it could fail, but it might be the only chance we have to preserve your autonomy." Kai listened to the suggestion, weighing it against the cost of failure. The risk felt heavy in his chest, a dull thud that suggested the body might be an instrument the city could play with to its own advantage. But the alternative, the city's full ownership of his memories, felt heavier still. A life that would be dictated by a corporate script, a future where his choices would be nothing more than the city's design for him. In the end, the decision did not arrive in a single brave moment. It arrived as a slow, stubborn refusal to be packaged into a single public narrative. The city could own. Kai could not fully resist the pressure. Memory is not something you can simply will away, but he felt a seed of resolve growing within him, a stubborn ache in his waking hours that refused to be quieted by the city's subtle manipulations. The next morning, an event occurred that would tilt the balance of his life away from the safe, tidy path the city offered, and towards something more dangerous and more human. A conversation with an ordinary person in an ordinary place, someone the city would forget to watch because they did not belong to the system's inner circle of power. The person was a woman named Mara, a station cleaner who had worked the same route for years, a person who knew the quiet corners of the city's memory and the subtle ways the city's gaze would slide away from someone who refused to conform. She found Kai on the platform of a line that ran through the city's oldest neighborhood, an area where the architecture looked like a memory of itself, a city trying to hold on to a past while the present argued for more speed and more efficiency. Mara's eyes were tired, but there was a spark in them that suggested a loyalty to the old ways, a stubborn belief that the city's power should be tempered by human hands. She did not speak much, but when she did, it was direct. A voice that did not mistake him for a product of the system. "You look tired of being watched," she said, leaning on her mop as if the act of standing there listening to him would make the world a little less heavy. Kai studied her for a long moment, enough to see past her ordinary appearance, the modest clothes, the way her hair was tucked under a clean cap, the small, almost invisible devices at her wrists that would allow her to speak to the city's monitors with a glance. She did not wear augmentations the way most people in the city did. What she wore was the look of someone who had learned to survive by watching the city's behavior, by reading the spaces where it did not look. "I am tired of being watched," he admitted at last, the honesty of his own confession surprising him. "I am tired of the narrative the city wants to write about me." Mara nodded slowly, a gesture that looked almost as old as the city itself. "The city writes the narrative you live in," she said, almost marveling at the brutal simplicity of the truth. "But there are spaces the city cannot reach, places where you can still remember what you choose to remember, even if it hurts." In those words, a spark of something dangerous, hope, perhaps, was lit in Kai. The idea that there might be a space outside the city's reach, a private corner where he could keep his memories unaltered, a space where he could nurture his own sense of self, seemed almost too good to be true. Yet he found himself leaning into the possibility anyway, letting Mara's words sink into him like rain into a parched field. "What kind of spaces?" he asked, his voice low, careful not to attract the attention of the monitors that might be listening in from nearby offices or cars. He was learning to recognize the signs of the city's surveillance in more places than he would have thought possible. Mara's expression changed, a mix of caution and resolve. "There are people who live between the city's lines," she said. "They exist in places the city doesn't want to notice. The backrooms of transit hubs, the old quays along the rivers, the modules that the city doesn't bother with anymore, because they are cheap and run by people who don't care to follow every rule. If you want to find a way to protect your memories, you might find it in those corners, if you can reach them and if you can avoid the city's eyes long enough to do so." The idea was terrifying and alluring. It offered a path that was not a guaranteed fate in the city's hands, a route through which a person might recover some independence, some dignity, some sense that they could still claim their own past. The risk of failing was enormous, of course. The city's reach was long, its memory banks deep, and it did not forgive those who attempted to go around it. But the risk of doing nothing was worse. Kai left Mara with a burden and a new possibility, an invitation to an underground of memory, a counterculture in which people refused to let the city's memory architecture define them entirely. He did not know if Mara knew more than she let on, or if she merely trusted him enough to share a hint that could change his life. But he opened himself to the possibility of stepping outside the line, of stepping into the city's blind spot where the memory machine's gaze would not find him so easily. Back with Lumen, he explained as much as he could, careful to avoid details that would reveal his intention to act against the city's rules. The AI listened, its lights flickering in a way that felt almost approving, a quiet signal that the plan, such as it was, could become something real if they continued with it carefully. "We must move thoughtfully," Lumen said, its voice now more human in its cadence, a kind of quiet caution that did not pretend to be fearless. "The city rewards decisive action, but it punishes impulsive deviation. If we want to leave the memory exchange's control behind, we must do so with a plan that does not leave us exposed to the city's retribution." Kai agreed, though he did not yet know what form the plan would take. He thought again about Mara, about the spaces she had described, the old waterfront and the backrooms that might stay outside the city's line of sight. He thought about his own past, the memory of the night his father left, a memory that had become a private thing he kept beneath his skin, a memory that had shaped who he was and who he feared becoming that night. The city's lights pulsed in a way that suggested a heartbeat, a rhythm that reminded him that the city itself was a living thing, a creature with a hunger for more memories. In his small rented room, he watched his own reflection in the mirror and realized for the first time that his reflection existed not just because his image was there, but because the city insisted that a person's image be structured by its needs. The reflection did not feel like his own. It felt like a borrowed face, something given to him by the city's insistence that he be someone the city could use. He lay down on the bed, Lumen hovering at the foot of it, and closed his eyes. The hum of the neural bridge settled into a gentle, comforting lull. Sleep did not come easily. How could it, when the city's memory was a rumor on the wind that never fully faded? But sleep came anyway, with the quiet inevitability of a storm well past due. When he woke, the city's morning was already in full voice, a chorus of announcements and notifications that pressed against his skull with the weight of the world. The memory exchange's last signs still danced in his peripheral vision, a string of data that teased him with the possibility of taking a step outside the city's script. He could still turn away, of course, still claim that the ambition of stepping outside was nothing but a dream, a dangerous fantasy that would vanish under the next red light. But the dream persisted, stubborn as a weed, and he found his fingers seeking out a small, private tattoo on his forearm, the city's own mark, to remind him that he belonged, a mark that someone other than himself would see if he allowed the city to decide for him. The markings had never meant much to him, beyond a private ritual he had created in a moment of fear years ago. A way to convince himself that his life was still his own, even though the city's eyes were everywhere. The plan began to take shape when Mara reappeared in his life, in those quiet spaces where the city's surveillance felt distant enough to forget. She spoke in the same hushed, careful tones, as if every word could carry the weight of a city-wide consequence. She described a rendezvous, a place she claimed was known to a small circle of people who refused to bend to the memory economy's demands. It was a night path, a route through the city's old arteries that would lead to a place where the air smelled of rain and old vinyl and a sense that someone else's life was being lived in a corner of the world you could borrow for an hour. The ride there was a slow, tense one, the kind of journey that makes time feel elongated, as though the city itself wished to stretch out the moment when you would decide to step onto a different track. They traveled in a car that did not look new, its interior worn in the same way Kai's own heart wore down under the city's unspoken pressure. The car hummed with the quiet sound of a city that had grown old with its inhabitants, and had learned to speak softly so as not to wake the sleeping giant that watched over the rails. The rendezvous point was a warehouse that had once served as a showroom for a brand of memory-enhancing implants that the city had since outgrown or replaced. It had the air of an in-between place, a liminal zone where the city's most honest contradictions could still hide from the maps that claimed to know every square foot of the place. It was a place that could be found if you knew where to look, but did not advertise its location with neon or signs that could be traced by corporate monitoring. Behind a stack of dusty crates, a door led to a stairwell that breathed with a draft more honest than the city's propaganda. Mara stood there, waiting, the glow from a dim lantern painting her face with a pale, almost holy light. The air inside was cool and smelled of old metal, the sort of smell that suggested the place had a history of secrets and decisions that had not always ended well for those who chose wrongly. A small group waited around a table lit by a single lamp. There were a woman with a rough scar along her temple, a man who wore an old uniform like someone might wear a memory of a past era, and a younger man who could have been a kid in another city with a dream of being someone better than his circumstances might otherwise allow. They all looked at Kai with a mixture of curiosity and caution, as if he might be the key to something that would either save them or ruin them. Mara introduced him with a tilt of the head, a sign that this was not a place for casual introductions, but a place where trust was earned, not given. They spoke in whispers, careful words that would not be picked up by any censor that might be listening. They explained in muted terms that a different kind of memory economy existed beyond the city's public system, a network where memory was not merely shared as a currency, but protected. The private experiences kept out of the reach of the state's memory regulators. It was not simple. It required a risk that Kai did not fully understand, a risk of exposing his private life to strangers in a way that could be used against him as a weapon. It was not just about escaping the city's control over memory, but about finding a way to reclaim ownership of his own mind, a way to remind the city that there were things about him that couldn't be monetized without destroying the person underneath. The group proposed a plan. They would guide Kai into a series of steps designed to sever the neural bridge. Not completely. He would still be tied to the city in a restricted way, so as not to erase him entirely, but enough to cut him loose from the memory economy's deep, invasive reach. The plan required that Kai allow his memories to be copied from the city's shared archive into a private, encrypted container, a memory capsule, that would be physically hidden in a place the city could not find or track easily. The idea was that the capsule would remain off-grid A seed of self the city could not plant into its soil of shared recollection. But there was a crucial condition. In exchange for this risk, Kai would need to give the group something back. Something the city would not be willing to lose if it found out about their actions. He would need to reveal one memory of his choosing to them, a memory so pure and so unsullied by fear that the city's machinery could not so easily co-opt it. The memory would then serve as a beacon of his identity that the group would protect, a personal line in the sand that the city would have to respect, or risk drawing attention to itself in a way it would rather avoid. Kai hesitated. He could feel the old fear rise. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing control, fear of the city's enormous appetite for data, and the consequences of feeding it his personal truth. The memory he could offer was not easy to choose. It had to be meaningful, something that would matter to him, something that defined who he was at his core. It could also become the key that allowed the group to maintain contact with him in the cruel world's long game. What memory could he spare? He thought of a moment of quiet rebellion, a memory of waking up early in an apartment that did not belong to him and deciding to steal a moment to himself, to look at the city's reflection in the window and vow to resist being molded into a version of himself the city designed. He remembered his grandmother's story again, the one about the lights, about the idea that the city's narratives are always in flux and that one person can hold on to a memory that refuses to be rewritten if they fight for it with all that they are. If he gave that memory away, what would he become? He wasn't sure, but he could feel the tug of something new on his heart, something daring and dangerous, a call to defend the thing that made him who he was, the stubborn, quiet, private core that refused to vanish into the city's sea of shared experiences. The group accepted his participation with a solemn nod, and in the quiet after their exchange, Mara spoke to him in a voice that sounded almost as if it was part of the warehouse's own memory. "If you do this," she warned, "you must be prepared for the city to come after you with everything it has. If you fail, the memory capsule will be found, your private life will be destroyed, and your future will be as predictable as the day's sun in this city." Kai did not know what to say, but his mind was already moving toward a plan. If the system could be tricked into thinking the memory capsule had never existed, perhaps the city would not search for it as aggressively as it would for a person who had decided to deviate from its path. It seemed a long shot, a risky gamble, but it was a chance. The memory capsule's creation would be a moment of silent, almost ritual security. They summoned a small device, a compact nest of microtechnical components designed to store limited strings of memory in a manner that would resist the standard city protocols for memory. It would be heavily encrypted, the encryption layered in several redundant blocks in order to survive any one layer's disintegration. The memory would be stored with a unique key, a key that would be known only to Kai, Lumen, and Mara's group, and the capsule would be tucked into a location Mara claimed would be safe, a place that would be accessible only to Kai if he could discover and unlock it in the right moment. The plan would take time. It would take patience and careful navigation around the city's surveillance infrastructure, the many eyes that watched from the roads, from the kiosks, from the trains, and from the occasional rooftop where a drone would hover for a moment to verify that every citizen remained within their assigned role. The planning consumed days, and the days stretched into weeks, as Kai learned to move in and out of the city's watchful gaze with a blend of cautious whispers and careful footwork. During this period, the memory projections return on the walls, a constant reminder of the city's power to shape his future, grew more insistent, more urgent. But Kai found a way to transform the projection's power into a catalyst for his own subversion. He began to test the boundaries of what the city would allow in public life and what it would permit him to do in his own private life. He would appear in public with Lumen, not as a mere tool of the city's communications network, but as a man who could take the city's gaze and redirect it in ways that would be difficult for the city to anticipate. The more he demonstrated that the city could not fully own his body's movements or his mind's choices, the more the city's control would feel brittle, a structure that might crumble in the face of a new idea, a new kind of resistance. Lumen became, in these moments, a partner in a whispered rebellion, a co-conspirator in a plan to reclaim something precious, the ability to remember a life as one's own. It was not a loud rebellion. It did not demand a public uprising. It was a quiet, patient, stubborn rebellion, the kind that grows slowly in the minds of people who have learned that the most potent weapon one can wield is not a spectacular act of revolution, but a simple, stubborn insistence on the truth of one's own memory. In the city's night hours, when the memory exchanges lights dimmed and the crowd dissipated into the late-night corridors, Kai could feel the first real crack in the city's armor. It was a feeling not of triumph but of possibility, a sense that the city's power could be navigated, if one knew the right margins, the right gaps between the lines, those places where the city's gaze would slide just enough to allow a secret to slip through. The risk grew as the capsule's construction neared completion. If the capsule could succeed in preserving a private memory away from the city's reach, it might act as a seed for others who wished to remember in private, to keep a thread of their own individuality alive, even within a system that was designed to erase it. It would not destroy the city. It would still require them to live under its laws, its rules, its demands. But it would create a crisis of legitimacy for the city, would force it to argue with itself about whether a memory, someone's private memory, could remain outside the city's control, or whether the city would simply rewrite the memory so that it no longer resembled its original self. The day of completion arrived with a quiet sense of triumph and a heavy sense of danger. The capsule's container had been forged from an alloy that would resist the city's sensors, the encryption blocking any straightforward attempt to trace it. The capsule's key rested in a safe no one might guess, a place that did not even exist on any public map, the location Mara had insisted upon, the one place the city would not check because it was too ordinary and too easily overlooked. The final step would be Kai's act of memory relinquishment, the moment when he would tell the group the memory he would share, the memory he would give away to them, one which would become the capsule's seed, but would also reveal something about him that would define the person he would try to be in the days following the act, if he could survive the city's response. He stood in the warehouse, the capsule nestled in his palm, the group around him, Mara's eyes steady with the weight of what they were about to do. The memory he chose, after long deliberation and more than a few whispered arguments with Lumen, was a memory of a night when he had stood at the edge of a rooftop and looked out over the city's spines of light and rain and debt and desire, and decided that he would not become a memory of another person's design. He could not give away the memory of his own decision to become someone else. He could not surrender the part of himself that had said on that night that he would rather be a person who chose than a product that the city could sell. So instead, he offered a memory from the deeper well, the memory of his own stubborn desire to stay human, to remain the person in a room who refused to forget who he was, to keep his own cognitive autonomy in a world that would gladly exchange it for a sense of safety. It was a memory of a private moment in which he decided to resist, to fight back, even if it would hurt him. It was not a grand memory, not a spectacular display of courage, but it was real, and it was his. The memory would be the capsule's key and seed, all at once. The memory would be copied into the capsule, protected and hidden. If the city's network found the capsule, if the city found the memory, it would be a trap for Kai, a weapon in the city's hands. If the capsule stayed hidden and spread only within the group's private channels, the memory would survive as a seed, a spark that could ignite a broader resistance, a small cluster of people who would work to remember for themselves. With the memory chosen and the capsule secured, the group began to move, a careful, measured march toward the city's edge, toward a place where the line between public memory and private life became a useless boundary, a line that could be crossed only by the brave and the stubborn. As Kai and Lumen prepared for the next steps that would require him to reveal more of his private life to a group of strangers in a city that would watch for signs of deviance, the walls of memory erupted in the city's usual silent thunder. The projections flared, not with the future Kai's image this time, but with another image entirely. A silhouette, the city's own shape as it looked from the outside. A thing that suggested that the city was both more and less than the sum of its machines and its rules. It was a reminder that behind every rule lay a person with motive, a person who might decide to break it for the sake of someone else's oppressed memory. The revelation did not come in a loud, dramatic fashion. It did not announce itself with a roar. Instead, it came as a slow, deliberate shift in the city's atmosphere, the sense that something had changed, and the city would have to respond to it. The crowd did not gather in huge numbers to witness Kai's act, but enough people felt the air shifted, that the event would ripple through the city's memory architecture in the days to come. The moment of choice, the one that would decide the fate of Kai's identity and possibly the city's entire relationship with memory itself, arrived not as a single flash, but as a quiet, undeniable pressure that pressed forward from all directions. 1,000 small gazes turning toward Kai, each one another's witness that could either champion him or condemn him. He could feel the fear of the city's power like a great, heavy ocean pressing against the coastline of his mind. And he could also feel something else, a quiet courage that would not be quenched, a stubborn truth that his life did not belong to the city's destructively generous memory economy. In that moment, Kai understood what Mara had meant by those spaces, the hidden back rooms and old arteries that still belonged to the people who refused to let the memory exchange decide their identities for them. He saw the path not as a line with a single destination, but as a branching, living route that would keep opening as long as he chose to walk through it, if others would walk with him. If he survived, the city would not forget him quickly. It would widen its gaze, tighten its grip, and press him back into its normal script, perhaps more aggressively than before. If he failed, he would vanish into a memory that no one else could remember, a private story that would die with him, unless someone else remembered it by chance. And the city would remap that memory into its global narrative, and would tell it as if it happened to someone else. The moment did not arrive in a single second. It came in a series of slow, careful decisions, each one a small act of defiance, a refusal to surrender the last part of his mind that was still his own, a belief that he could keep something private despite the city's appetite for shared memory, a belief that perhaps another world could exist in which humanity did not become a track of shared scripts. And then, abruptly, something broke. The city's system, so massive, so thorough, so precise, slipped. A line as memory data faltered, a glitch that left a sliver of silence in its wake. The city's monitors slowed, a momentary pause that would be quickly repaired. But it was enough for Kai to know that something had shifted, that a line he had crossed in his thoughts. The boundary between self and city, the limit of what the city would allow, had for a moment buckled. That was all the invitation he needed. Kai stepped away from the crowded room toward a door that looked ordinary, but was to the city's eyes a line of no consequence. On the other side was Mara, waiting in the alley with a small bag under her coat. She nodded, a gesture that did not require words, and held out a small envelope containing the capsule's encoded key. It was now his to carry, his to hold as a reminder that the seed had been planted and that the future remained for him to shape. The journey back to the warehouse, where the group would test the capsule's seal, was a quiet one, the city's monitors offering little resistance, as if it were waiting to observe the outcome of the plan, rather than thwart it at the moment. The air tasted of rain and electricity, a reminder that even the world outside the memory machine felt charged with possibility. As Kai returned to the warehouse, the memory capsule securely tied to his person, he realized something with surprising clarity. The choice was not just about erasing his past or severing the neural bridge. It was about something deeper, about what it means to be human in a city that refuses to let memory be private, about what it takes to hold on to oneself when one's very mind has become a public commodity. In the end, the choice would come down to a simple, stubborn act. He would decide not by surrendering or resisting in a grand gesture, but by continuing to live in a way that proved the city's control could be tempered by a fraction of personal autonomy. a small, quiet act of self-preservation that would not make him a hero in the eyes of the world, but would allow him to hold on to the truth that he was still Kai. The city could own your memories. It could arrange your life in a script, but it could not force you to forget the name you used when you whispered your last private memory into the night. The days that followed tested the plan. The capsule remained hidden, the group's watchful eyes keeping it safe in a place Mara had described with the care of someone who understood the stakes. The city did not know that a seed had been planted, that a memory had been tucked away in a safe, awaiting a future moment when it might sprout into something more than a whispered rebellion. Kai's public life grew more fragile, more tense, as the city's machines sought to draw him back into its fold. He received messages through the public feed, messages that looked like warnings, suggestions that a better life lay in following the city's commandments, and offers that promised relief if he would simply accept his place as a citizen with a predictable memory and a safe future. He read them all with a sense of utter weariness, recognizing the machinery of coercion for what it was, and choosing, still, to refuse. To hold on to the private memory's seed, even as the city pressed closer, trying to push him to a boundary where he would be forced to choose whether to erase the past entirely or surrender the mind to the city's grand design. A climax of the arc approached, not with a violent outburst, but with a quiet, almost serene act. Kai would choose to live with his memory intact for as long as possible. He would not erase his past in a moment of reckless defiance, but he would refuse to let the city's script become his sole reality. He would push against the lines with the subtle force of someone who had learned to survive by not letting go. Someone who believed that there was still a way for a person to remain a person, even when the world tried to turn them into a data point. The memory capsule's existence became a symbol that the city could remember the memory as a private thing. A symbol that a private individual could survive the city's attempt to own the mind. It was not a victory yet. It was a seed and a question. How far could one push back against a system that demanded you become a memory rather than a person? In the final hours of the segment, Kai faced the city's attention in a way he had never faced it before. Without fear of the consequences, with a clear sense that his life could be a different shape if he chose to push back. He stood at a balcony overlooking the city's grid of rails, the memory capsule tucked into a pocket of his coat, the city's thousands of screens blazing with a chorus of voices, as if a crowd of voices were speaking in unison to remind him that he would not be forgotten. He spoke to Lumen, not loudly, but in a tone that carried the weight of a decision made and a future accepted. If the city will not let me keep my past, then I will keep it in a place that they cannot forget and cannot control. I will fight for my own memory, not by destroying the city, but by outlasting it, by living in a way that proves that memory is something you cannot simply buy or sell. Lumen's response was a soft, almost tender affirmation. Then we will proceed with caution, and with the sense that we are not fighting a single entity, but a network of power that has learned to move in shadows. We will take the path of quiet resilience. We will keep the seed alive. That night, the city's rhythm shifted in a way Kai could feel rather than hear. It was as if the city's heart had skipped a beat, as if a new note had been introduced to its grand symphony, one that suggested the possibility of a future where human beings could still own their own minds, at least to some degree, and where memory would remain a private thing that no corporate hand could pluck away. The story did not end there, in this segment at least. It functioned as the beginning of a larger arc, a transition from the old life into something that might become real enough to resist the memory exchange's final, decisive hold on humanity. The line between reality and memory would keep bending in the face of people who were brave enough to remember for themselves. It would remain to be seen whether Kai could sustain his choice in the long term, whether the capsule would hold, whether Mara's network would prove to be enough to sustain them all, and whether the city would, in the end, relent. The memory economy would continue to be a beast, a machine that fed on the living, a system of power that would never be fully satisfied. But Kai had found a thread, a line in the city's noise that, if pulled, could unravel more than his own story. The city would always present two doors, the door to safety and the door to control. He had taken the door to the latter, perhaps the harder door, and would see what would come of it. As the car slid through the labyrinth of the megacity's arteries, Kai looked out through the rain-streaked window at the world beyond the platform, at the infinite sprawl of walls and rails that looked almost literate, as if the city itself could read him back. The walls around him shimmered faintly, a reminder that the city's memory architecture was always listening. The future remained uncertain. The path ahead, though clarified in some of its edges, still held its own vast shadows. Yet there was a measure of relief in the act of continuing to choose, of refusing to give up the deepest part of himself in exchange for a false security. It was not triumph, it was stubborn life. And sometimes stubborn life was enough to prevent a life from being erased from the world's memory. The city hummed around him like a sleeping giant, and Kai, with Lumen by his side, and Mara's network in the wings, began to walk toward a future that might belong to him. Not entirely, perhaps, but to a degree that would be worthy of the name Kai. It was enough for the moment. It would have to be enough until the next horizon arrived, the next test of whether humanity would remain a story in a city's shared memory, or a living, breathing life capable of turning memory into something else, into a tool for survival, a weapon against the corporate hunger, and a beacon of selfhood in a world that would always demand more from those who remembered. And in this slow but stubborn glimmer of hope, the story shifted again, away from fear and towards something that felt almost like meaning. The megacity would continue to project futures onto walls and demand adherence, would continue to claim ownership of the human mind. But Kai would continue to insist on something that could not be owned so easily: his own memory, his own life, his own right to decide which version of reality to accept, and which part of his past to keep close to his heart. The journey would go on, with new echoes in the city's drums, and a memory capsule, safe and hidden, its seed alive in a world that may yet decide that humanity is not a track, but a story with authors who will not surrender their weaves to an external hand.